online series for alumni. It's a program that we've called Explore, and we've certainly looked forward to sharing with you over this webinar and many others opportunities for you to explore new topics, new skills, new people. But firstly, before we get underway and before I introduce our speaker, and as a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people and custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Kate Robertson. I'm the Executive Director of Advancement, and Alumni Relations is part of my portfolio. So I'm really thrilled to be able to host this first webinar in our new Explore series, and looking forward to an interesting afternoon with you all. The series Explore provides an opportunity specifically for you as members of the alumni community to gain some advancement and inspiration. And one of the greatest advantages of being an alumnus of the university is the ability to tap into a group of influential individuals with a vast global impact. And I don't think you'll be disappointed by this afternoon's webinar. So the series offers you an exclusive opportunity to connect with your peers and to find among them innovators, thought leaders, and perhaps even potential collaborators. And that's just for starters. You really are such an important part of the fabric of the university, and it's why we're so pleased to be providing these opportunities for you to access webinars tailored to your needs, such as this one this afternoon. And the interest from this webinar has really been unprecedented. So we're pleased that it seems to have resonated with you. And so thank you again for taking the time to join us. Just a few housekeeping notes before today's presentation gets underway. Your microphone and camera and the chat function and the raised hand function, for those of you who are already familiar with Zoom, they've all been disabled just so that Lila's not interrupted during her presentation. But we do encourage you to submit questions during the course of the webinar. And that can be done by typing them into the Q&A function. That's not been disabled. So do put questions during the course of the talk into the Q&A function, and Lila will be really pleased to answer those when she's finished her formal presentation. And just one other thing to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for later access on our YouTube channel. So now let me introduce you to our topic today, which is the impact of stress and isolation on the brain. And let me introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Lila Landowski. So Lila is a neuroscientist, science communicator and science advocate. And she's received multiple awards for her academic teaching and community engagement. And this includes being named Australia's 16th Science Superhero by Australia's Chief Scientist, the 2015 Premier's Young Achiever of the Year, a Tasmanian finalist for Young Australian of the Year in 2016, and more recently named a 2018 Young Tall Poppy Award winner. Dr. Landowski is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Tasmania Stroke Research Group, investigating stroke and fatigue, and she's also a director of the Australian Society for Medical Research and a director of Epilepsy Tasmania. So with all of those introductory formalities over with, it gives me very great pleasure to now hand over to Lila.
There, we got great. So many of you might have noticed that as we've been stuck in isolation, things are changing in the way that we're thinking. You mightn't be able to make decisions as clearly. You might be really tired. You might be finding that you are having issues with productivity. Your mental health might have deteriorated. You might be having nightmares. And for some of us, we're having a strange surge in productivity. So I mean, the thing is, it all makes perfect sense if we think about the changes that are happening in the brain as we're isolated. And I'm going to go into that. So I'm going to be exploring in this talk why this is happening and hopefully empower you with some ways in which we can deal with it. And I'll start by teaching you some neuroscience, how we learn and remember things, why sleep is critical, and how all of that is going on. Then we'll explore what stress is, and we'll discuss how it affects our brain. And then we'll look at isolation specifically and how that affects our brain. And lastly, hopefully we'll find out what we can actually do about it so that way we can lead more functional lives than many of us are at this point. So let's have a look at the beginning. So this is a fresh human brain. It weighs about 1.3 kilos, so about 2% of the average body weight of an average adult. It has the consistency of jelly, and you can see it's got this incredible network of blood vessels on the surface. And that's what that's doing is it's pumping 20% of the blood from your heart. 20% of the oxygen is coming from your lungs and feeding that brain and giving it energy. And it's not really very surprising though, if we consider that it's literally controlling everything that we are doing right now. Now, the brain does a lot of things, but we need to remember that the brain's priority is always survival. So first and foremost, it's here to keep us alive. And the brain is able to keep us alive and helps us think and learn and communicate and do all those things by using neurons. So zoomed in under the microscope, neurons look a little bit like this. So here's the cell body, and the branches here are called axons, and dendrites are what connects the cell to another part of the body. So they're almost like electrical wires, and they're sending signals telling those body parts what to do. And body parts then transmit information back to the brain as well. So for example, this is how we can balance on a tightrope, for example. So your body is telling your brain whether its instructions were good, or whether you can actually walk in a straight line. And then your brain tells your body to correct its position to keep you stable on that rope. But I guess what's most relevant here is the way that neurons in the brain are communicating with one another to allow us to think and to form thoughts. So we know that the brain is all about change. It gives us the ability to learn and to do new things. And all of our individual skills and our abilities are very much shaped by the environments that we are in. Now, you might think that a talented person has some magic thing about them that the rest of us don't have. But the reality is it mostly comes down to practice and perseverance. And when they started learning whatever that thing is. For example, great footy players aren't born, they're trained. How do we know this? Well, if we think of babies, for example, they're adorable, but they can't do anything on their own. We have to guide them through life in those early years. And despite developing in utero for 9 months, they haven't been shaped by their experiences yet. When you see a baby trying things for the first time, they get it wrong, 1,000 times before they get it right. Just like me here playing in my first proper footy match. I kind of look like I know what I'm doing, but it's actually just clever photography. I was useless, and I still actually am because I haven't trained. And, the good news is that you can be better at anything in this moment if you train. We can train our brain to be better at any task. Just like exercising helps to build muscle, repetitive patterns of thinking and doing things strengthens those pathways in the brain that are involved in us doing that thing. Anything that we do repeatedly becomes hardwired, and then we become able to do it autonomously. Like riding a bicycle. So at first you have to concentrate really hard to balance and to pedal and to not fall off. And then it becomes suddenly completely autonomous. Those parts of the brain that are involved in those body movements, that pedaling and that balance, they become so practiced that they walk automatically without you having to put any conscious effort into it. And this is the same thing that happens when we become an expert in anything, something that you're doing at work or a sport. But here's the catch, right? So when you're learning something, you're actually making brand new connections between different parts of the brain. You're making more of those connections. And that takes a lot more energy than just your regular everyday thinking. So this making new connections is a bit like wearing a path in a forest by walking back and forth a lot. And then you've got to turn that track into a road and then into a highway. Now, when we're learning new things, we're literally creating these new connections and these new pathways in the brain. And it takes a lot of energy. So this is why learning new things is literally exhausting, And the brain works in the same way when we think more generally. So not just when you're learning. So, you might have someone who, for example, is really negative about everything in life. They, approach things with negative thoughts. And, if you consistently do something like approach life with negative thoughts, those pathways in your brain become so well worn that that way of thinking becomes autonomous. So people who always think negatively will always react negatively. But, you know, the good news is that we can change it by training, by telling yourself to actively think positively in every situation. And eventually that way of thinking will prevail. So, you know, here's a challenge. If you're one of those people who always says sorry in every situation, I challenge you for 3 days to not say sorry or to not apologize with every action that you do, and just see what happens. All right, so I mentioned babies before. You know, babies are always learning. They're on this massive learning curve, the biggest learning curve of their life. And as I also mentioned, learning means the brain is working hard to make new connections, and that takes a lot of energy. It's exhausting. And they also sleep a lot. Now, why is that? Now, the two things are related. You know, the number one thing that we actually need to do to actually remember the things we learn is sleep. And because, you know, it turns out sleep is when all the things that we learn throughout the day get consolidated into long-term memories. So when we do things during the day, our brain is actually using part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is this area here in red. And that's keeping track of all the things we've done. It's a bit like a diary. So if I was to ask you what you were doing before listening to this talk, you're using your hippocampus to recall that information. But the hippocampus only keeps memories there for a really short term, for, you know, less than a day. And when we sleep, all those short-term memories within the hippocampus get shuffled out to other parts of the brain and become long-term memories. And all the irrelevant information gets eroded away. So if you don't sleep, all those short-term memories that were stored in the hippocampus can't be turned into long-term memories. They just become eroded away, which is why cramming in information and then not sleeping is pretty much the worst thing you can do for your learning. You're wasting all your hard work. Now you're probably wondering how much sleep is enough. And I guess for most of us in the audience, it's about 7 to 9 hours. And anything less than that, you're starting to compromise your memory. Now, as a result of everything that's happened here with COVID-19, some people are describing having strange dreams or having nightmares, you know, or even for the first time, they're remembering their dreams. Or what even are dreams? I guess we can think of dreams as being like a show reel, which is partly things that have happened in our life, which are stitched together in completely made up ways. Now, many of you have probably heard of REM sleep. So REM sleep is the most shallow stage of sleep, and that's where dreaming happens. So if we're looking at this graph here, on the x-axis we've got time, and as you drift into sleep, you go from REM down into deep sleep, back up into REM, down into deep sleep, and so forth, about 5 times in the average night. Now, you are only dreaming in that REM period. So if you wake up during your deep sleep, you're not dreaming, so you won't remember your dreams. Now, if you wake up in your REM sleep, you will remember your dreams, but only for the first couple of minutes. And after the first couple of minutes, if you don't actually actively think about the dream you had or write it down, you won't remember it, which, you know, is actually really important, because then you would, if you remembered all your dreams, you would start to forget what is dream and what is reality. And, you know, things could get really awkward if you thought an inappropriate dream you had about someone you knew was real, because you would forget which is which. Now, a lot of people in isolation are finding that they are sleeping longer and therefore waking up in this REM period, which is why you tend to remember your dreams. Now, a lot of people are describing having nightmares as well, or thinking about having dreams about the past. Now, when in isolation, many of us are living quite a monotonous life. So when the variety of life is not very exciting, our dreams sort of take inspiration from the past, which is why we tend to start thinking about the past in our dreams if life is a bit boring. Another thing that I mentioned was nightmares. And if you are, you know, quite stressed or anxious, you tend to have more stressed and anxious dreams. So I guess nightmares tend to be a reflection of our emotional state. So just to summarize that, if we're sleeping longer, we're more likely to remember our dreams and wake up in that REM stage. If we have a bit of a boring life, we tend to be thinking more about the past in our dreams and using that for inspiration. And if we're more anxious or afraid, we tend to have more bad dreams. Okay, so now you probably know more than 99% of the people do about the brain, which is fantastic. But let's actually talk about stress. What even is stress? Stress, it's a feeling that we've all experienced when we've been challenged or overwhelmed. But it's more than just a word or an emotion. Stress is a hardwired physical response that travels throughout all of your entire body. And what many of us are going through with COVID-19 isolation, that's a type of stress. If someone asks you, if you're stressed and you say yes, how do you know? What sort of symptoms do you experience? And this is an example of some of the many things that we might experience when we're stressed. It's impacting essentially our entire body. And the body's stress response is all about survival. So here's a textbook example of the body's stress response. So here you can see it in action. You've probably heard it called the fight or flight response. We call it the acute stress response, and it basically means the quick response. So the iguana, it sees the snake and the brain's panic button called the amygdala. It triggers the body to release the stress hormones like adrenaline, noradrenaline, and then eventually cortisol. And these trigger the fight or flight response, this acute stress response. And, your heart beats faster, your airways dilate, your breathing quickens, the energy in your fat and your muscle stores becomes mobilized, your blood vessels in your muscles open up, so more oxygen is getting to where it needs to be. You start sweating, you can't feel pain, so you can focus on escaping. Our brain switches off anything that isn't going to make you survive in that moment. You forget about digesting food. In fact, sometimes, your digestive tract tries to evacuate itself through pooing, peeing, or vomiting, because if you're about to become someone else's dinner, it doesn't matter really whether you're digesting your own. It's going to help you escape. So I think what I'm trying to say here is this hardwired sequence of responses is helping the iguana to fight the threat off, or in this case, flee to safety. So this is why we call it the fight or flight response. But here's the thing. Our body reacts in the exact same way to modern day stresses that are not life-threatening. So this happens when you're sitting a test, when you're running a race, when you're worried about your mum or your dad when they're sick, and it happens when you're suddenly in the middle of a pandemic. So we know that some amounts of stress are good because they're pushing you just to the level of optimal performance, as we saw in that other video. It has really beneficial effects for the body. Now, many of you might have found yourself really excited and enthusiastic about life at the start of this isolation period. And that's because we were getting bursts of these stress hormones here and there. And then a few of the things that it's doing in this situation is it's priming your immune system so it's ready to fight a battle. So, if you think about it, that's great, because if you're running away from a snake and you injure yourself, you don't want to get sick and infected from that injury that you've had. We also get this experience, when we experience short-term stress, we get a hormone called oxytocin released in the brain, and that makes us more social. And we know that being social has huge benefits for the brain and the body. We also know that short-term stress improves our cognitive performance, so our thinking. It improves our ability to learn and to adapt to situations. And that's how isolation started off for many of us. But then for many of us again, that shifted into changes in mood and in memory, and we've had issues with attention or decision-making. I guess the question is, why does this turn into that? Well, it comes down to long-term stress and how long-term stress affects your brain. So when you become stressed and you can't switch off that response, you develop chronic stress, long-term stress. So maybe the kids are suddenly at home instead of being at school and you've got ridiculous work pressures on you and you're trying to manage the kids. Maybe you've lost your job and the bills keep coming. You know, maybe you're caring for someone with a severe illness or disability, maybe over many years. Maybe you've got a parent or a sibling with substance abuse issues. You know, over weeks to months, that chronic stress response, it accumulates and it takes a toll on the body. So your body stays in survival mode and it doesn't have time to recover. And remember, survival mode takes a lot of energy. So you end up being more likely to get high blood pressure. Your immune system becomes weaker. Your cells age faster across your entire body, and it's damaging our brain cells. So remember, the brain's priority is survival, but being stressed takes a lot of energy. So maintaining that survival instinct comes at the expense of something. Now, unfortunately, it's actually our most sophisticated behaviors, our higher order thinking, our cognition, our problem solving, our learning, our memory, all of that goes to the wayside in favor of survival. Now, remember the amygdala that I mentioned before? It's the panic button center of the brain. So the amygdala is involved in processing emotions, and it's driving our most primitive survival instincts. So someone who's chronically stressed needs to adapt to their current levels of stress, so that way they can quickly react to the next time they encounter a new stress. So the amygdala increases its activity and actually grows in size as it's increasing the connections inside it. So, you know, people who are chronically stressed will have a bigger amygdala. Now, here's the thing. So the size of the amygdala is correlated with aggressive behavior across species. So more aggressive people tend to have bigger amygdalas. So do more aggressive chimps. So do more aggressive rats. So you can guess what might happen if chronic stress is making your amygdala expand. And I think the key to remember here, it's not a person's fault that stress has changed their reactivity and their aggression. It's the brain is physically changing. It's trying to cope with this very difficult situation that it's faced with. Now, you know how kids, you know, they tend to behave like very small, irrational, maybe drunk adults. And the reason for that is because the decision-making part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, it's still developing. It's only just started developing. And in fact, the prefrontal cortex doesn't even finish developing until we're about age 25. Now, when you're chronically stressed, your amygdala, so the panic button center of the brain, weakens its connection with the prefrontal cortex, so the decision-making part of the brain. So if we think that if we consider that the prefrontal cortex is making us, helping us make decisions and stop and think and reflect and work out how to tackle a situation, and if the chronic stress is actually weakening our connection with this decision-making part, you know, we're going to have effects. So chronic stress is weakening our connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, so between the emotion part and the decision-making part. So our behavior becomes reactive rather than purposeful. We might be more impulsive or more snappy or angry or impatient than you normally would have been. So say you've got a child and the child is screaming at you and you automatically want to scream back at them. You know, that's actually just your amygdala reacting organically to this situation, but deciding not to yell. Now that's more deliberate and it takes time. It's your prefrontal cortex in action. So you're accessing your experience and your wisdom, and it takes a few seconds to assess the situation and work out how to react appropriately. So if I've just described you, it's fine, like you can fix this, and I'll tell you how in just a minute, but there's one more thing that I need you to understand first, and that's that the hippocampus, so this is that learning and memory center of the brain, it's really heavily affected in chronic stress as well. So we know that stress hormones, particularly cortisol, it causes the hippocampus to shrink. Neurons actually die. You know, the connections between neurons in the hippocampus become weaker, which makes it much more difficult to remember things, particularly a traumatic or a stressful experience. Our memories become fragmented. And that's exactly why people who have been chronically stressed might have trouble keeping track of what they're doing. You know, you might have a hard time remembering things. You might have brain fog. Maybe you can't think as creatively, and it makes you less adaptive. And remember, all of this is actually happening because during chronic stress, the brain's priority is survival. And that comes at the expense of all of these really sophisticated behaviors that we have. So let's quickly summarize this. So the emotion part of the brain, the amygdala, it increases in size. So we become more reactive, more impatient, more emotional, more aggressive. And then it becomes disconnected from the decision-making part. So we have a harder time thinking clearly, making decisions, being creative, you know, focusing on tasks or controlling our impulses as well. And the memory part shrinks, which makes it harder for us to learn and be attentive to certain tasks. All right, so isolation is a type of stress and it's affecting our brain in a lot of different ways. But in terms of working out how isolation specifically affects us, it's quite a hard thing to really study properly, and we haven't been able to do brain scans or other physiological tests on people who have been involuntarily thrust into isolation, for example, in war or in a natural disaster. We can do it on people who have isolated themselves by choice. So, for example, if they've gone into space or if they've gone to Antarctica. But the thing is, they're going to respond a little bit differently to people who isolate involuntarily. And part of that is due, not only, it comes down to hope. You know, people who are voluntarily doing this, they know when the end is going to be, but people who don't have that same hope. And we can also look at people who have chosen to isolate in Antarctica, for example, but it's hard to disentangle the effects of this weird situation that they've put themselves in, for example, for work. You know, people going into space have a huge dose of radiation, and that affects the brain too. So how do you know, I guess, tease apart what is what? And, you know, we also know that people who voluntarily do this sort of thing tend to be a little bit different from the rest of the population. They tend on average to be on average rate higher than the average person in terms of intelligence, in terms of their risk-taking skills, their impulsivity. All of these things are a little bit different. And we know that being isolated is really difficult, even if you choose to do it. And I'll just give you an example here. Back in 2018, there was a professional gambler and he bet $100,000 that he could survive 30 days alone in total darkness. So he was in a small room, completely dark. He had a bed, fridge, bathroom, everything that he needed to survive. But he couldn't last more than 20 days. And after being asked later why he couldn't handle it, he said it was because he started having hallucinations, even just in a few days. He started seeing bubbles and the sky opened up. Sometimes people feel a ghostly presence in the room. And this happens because when the brain is starved of stimulation, it doesn't have anything new to look at, you know, it becomes overreactive and over-responsive to just the tiniest thing. So many of us are already living in small apartments, in a concrete jungle, and really being in isolation has restricted our ability to get outdoors. Now we know that, for example, when mice are housed in isolation, levels of certain growth factors in the brain changes after just 2 weeks. Now these growth factors are a bit like a brain fertilizer. So they keep the cells in the brain working optimally, and that helps them survive. Now we have the same growth factors in our brain, and we know that having low levels of these growth factors increases our risk of anxiety and depression, which is why you might have noticed that your mental health is deteriorating if you're cooped up inside for long periods of time. You know, there's another study that reported that, you know, after mice have been placed in social isolation, just after a month of that, the neurons in the sensory part of the brain and in the motor part of the brain, so the parts that's sensing things around you and moving around you, that shrunk by 20% in just 1 month. Now, we can also look at studies of people who have been incarcerated and put into solitary confinement. And this drop in growth factors sort of explains a lot of the observations that we have seen in those populations. So like the rats, people in confinement have increases in anxiety after just 4 days. They have more depression. They have memory and concentration issues, impulse control issues, and aggression, which we know happens when there's chronic stress, like we've just talked about. They're also more likely to be suicidal. They have issues with paranoia, hallucinations, panic attacks, and they tend to develop more long-term health issues like PTSD, for example. Now, if all of this sounds like it resonates with you, don't worry, because at the end of the day, you're still you. It's just that chronic stress of isolation and the situation that we're in, it's changing our brain, which has changed how you react to situations. But when the stress resolves, you can adapt back. And I guess a basic rule of thumb is the longer that someone's been stressed, the longer it's going to take them to bounce back. Now, here's the exciting part, what we can actually do about it. So there's a recent study which showed that being in a green space, so just being around trees at a park, walking through a green leafy avenue, that actually reduces the levels of stress hormones, specifically cortisol, in our blood. So just by sitting in nature or walking through it, you don't even have to exercise, it decreases cortisol by 18.5% in 20 minutes. And it plateaus after about 20 minutes. So spending more time isn't more beneficial for you. We also know that having lots of rich and varied life experiences or working in a stimulating environment, we know it's good for us for another reason. It reduces our risk of dementia, for example, later in life. And studies in mice and rats show that one of the reasons why this stimulating environment is so good for us is because it is enhancing the growth of brand new brain cells. Now, we used to think that you had a fixed number of brain cells, a fixed number of neurons, and that they slowly died off as we drank too much or, if life got difficult. And it turns out that's not true. So our brain actually has stem cells, and stem cells have the ability to make new brain cells. So in theory, we can stimulate those stem cells and help replenish all those neurons that we lose when we've been under chronic stress. So how else can we encourage our brain to make new neurons? There's a few different ways. So exercise is the most powerful stimulant of new neurons that we know of. So among many other things, we know that exercise increases blood flow to the brain. It raises the levels of those brain fertilizer growth factor compounds as well. We know that exercise reduces the level of those stress hormones, especially cortisol. It also helps release endorphins, which makes you feel good. And lastly, adrenaline. It releases adrenaline. And adrenaline actually increases our attention and our focus. And the science tells us that 10 minutes of exercise improves our focus and our productivity 2 to 4 hours after we do it. So if you're trying to focus on a task, quickly do a little bit of exercise, and you'll probably find that you can actually do that task a bit more efficiently. So you're probably wondering, what's the optimum minimum amount of exercise to help us reduce the effects of stress, to enhance the growth of these new neurons? Now, the answer is we don't actually know, and it's probably going to be different depending on your genetics and so forth. Now, the best advice we have at the moment is that at least 30 minutes of aerobic exercise every second day is what you're aiming for. So, sweating, getting that heart rate up for 30 minutes a day, every second day. So I'd like you to think about this. If you're someone who's not exercising at all at the moment, I want you to do some exercise a few times a week, get that blood properly pumping for at least 20 minutes, okay? And after a couple of weeks of that, I want you to think about how your brain is functioning. And I bet you'll realize that you're thinking a bit more clearly than you have been previously. For about 50 years, actually, we've known that people who are more socially isolated are more likely to die. And there's about a 30% increased risk in mortality in those people who have spent years in social isolation and not socializing. And most of that is actually due to the effects of stress on the body. We know that socially isolated people are also less able to deal with stressful situations. Now, we know that social connectedness and being with other people is one of the best predictors of happiness and health in older age. So the Harvard study of adult development, which is one of the world's longest running studies, they found that one of the best predictors of good health when you're older are people who describe being happy with their relationships in middle age. Now, we know that when we're socializing with someone that we really like, what's happening is our brain is releasing a cocktail of hormones, things like oxytocin, endorphins, and that's helping us feel closer to that person. And it's also helping to activate our brain's reward system, which is why we feel good after we've socialized with someone that we like. Now, it's the same part of the brain that's involved in making food taste good. It's also responsible for us driving addiction. So this part of the brain is actually being stimulated when we're socializing with people. And socializing doesn't just make us feel closer to other people. It physically makes us feel better because it's also reducing those stress hormone levels like cortisol in our body. Now, you might have noticed in isolation that talking on the phone to a loved one actually makes you feel a bit better than just texting. And there's actually a reason for that. So we know that text messaging activates this reward pathway, so it makes us feel good. But talking on the phone activates the reward pathway, so it makes us feel good. And it also releases oxytocin, which doubles that effect really. We also know that sex also makes your brain release a lot of oxytocin. So if you're getting some, good for you. Diet is another thing that we can do to help make these new neurons in the brain. So the science suggests that changing our diet by reducing our calorie intake from the recommended amount by 20 to 30%, or introducing intermittent fasting, so spacing the time between your meals, that helps you make new neurons. Now, on the other hand, we know that if you've got a diet which is really high in sugar or fats, that tends to have the opposite effect on your brain. And that's a really interesting one because we know that when you're chronically stressed, you actually have more appetite for calorie-rich foods, fatty foods. And that's because, remember, being stressed is putting you in survival mode, and that takes a lot of energy. Now, you might have found yourself emotional or comfort eating in isolation. Now, this is kind of a way of us trying to make us feel good and suppress negative emotions just by using food. And the reason why that happens is, sweet junk food, it's activating that reward pathway in our brain. So it's actually making us feel really good in the short term. So I guess what I want to recommend here is that we try and lay off the high sugar and the high fat treats if we can. Now, if you're not sleeping well, it's ultimately going to make the effects of stress worse. And that's because not sleeping blocks neurogenesis, or it stops you making those new brain cells. And we know things like that a night of no sleep is pretty much the same as having a blood alcohol level of 0.1%. It also makes you about 30% more anxious, and it makes your amygdala, so that panic button center of the brain, 60% more reactive, which is why you might find yourself being so emotional and so volatile when you haven't slept. But it's kind of tricky because when we are stressed, it's elevating the level of that stress hormone cortisol, and cortisol makes us awake and alert, so it stops us from going to sleep. So being stressed stops us from sleeping properly at night, and it also stops us from falling back asleep if we wake up in the middle of the night. Another thing we know is that depression also disrupts sleep. So this is also affecting people's ability to sleep properly during isolation. So I guess what can we do in this situation? We know that, for example, exposure to light is delaying the release of our sleep-inducing hormone melatonin. So if you try and avoid bright lights about 2 hours before bed, or get a blue light filter, which blue light is the wavelength of light that suppresses melatonin the most. That can help. If we stick to a routine, so going to bed at the same time, helps program our body to go to sleep when we try. And also a difficult one for many of us at this point is laying off the alcohol, because alcohol actually reduces the quality of our sleep as well. Now, the next one is antidepressants. And obviously this is only relevant if you're suffering from clinical depression and having it managed by a doctor with medication. But the thing is, in depression, parts of the brain actually shrink and become increasingly disconnected. And it's a lot like what is happening in stress. So people have only just come to realize that, you know, promoting neurogenesis is probably one of the main ways that antidepressants actually treat depression. So we know that if you're taking an antidepressant, it usually takes at least 2 weeks for people to start feeling a bit more of the positive effects of those antidepressants, if they're lucky enough to find one that works for them. But that's really weird, because the antidepressants actually change your brain chemistry almost straight away, within minutes, yet it takes weeks for us to see that response. And that is because it takes at least 2 weeks for all these brand new neurons to start getting integrated into the brain. Now, there's one thing that decreases neurogenesis that we definitely can't change, and that's age. So the volume of our brain actually declines with age, and it does that at a rate of about 5% per decade after we hit 40. So that's why it might be a bit harder for us as we get older. And it's also why we become more vulnerable to stress-related changes or neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's as we get older as well. Now, we can even change the impact of chronic stress by simply changing the way that we think about it. So just picture when you're stressed and your heart is pounding, you know, you're sweating, your stomach's doing somersaults. You know, we tell ourselves all the time that that's not normal and that we're not coping with the situation. But the thing is, it's actually completely normal, because it's our biological response to stress. It's helping us prime ourselves to perform better. So let me just tell you about a study that made me rethink my whole approach to stress. So this study tracked about 30,000 people in the United States over 8 years. And they started by asking people, how much stress have you had in the last year? And they also asked, you know, do you believe that stress is bad for your health? And then they used public health records to figure out who died. So the bad news is that the people who experienced a lot of stress in the previous year had a 43% increased risk of dying. But that was only true for the people who thought that stress was harmful for their health. Now, we know that people who experience a lot of stress but didn't view stress as harmful weren't more likely to die. In fact, they had the lowest risk of dying of anyone in the study, including people who didn't actually have that much stress in their lives. So, you know, when your heart is pounding and you're breathing faster, maybe you're breaking out into a sweat, you know, if we think of that as us actually dealing with the situation, we will actually do better. And in fact, a study which was conducted in Harvard a while ago now, what they did is they got people to do a social stress test, and they were taught to rethink that stress is good, that this response that you're feeling is actually good for you. And those that viewed stress as a good thing performed way better than the people who thought that stress was bad for them. And I guess this is really what a lot of the new science of stress is telling us. You know, it's how we think about stress that also really matters. And it's just really surprising to think that all of these solutions we have to our current situation are really accessible, and they're simple. You know, sleep and exercise and diet, they're just the pillars of our health. And our body really has all the solutions if we just treat our body in the right way. Now, if you know someone or yourself are struggling, I encourage you to contact Lifeline on 131114 or look up Beyond Blue or Headspace on the internet. And if you want to do some further reading, there's some excellent resources made by the UTAS clinical psychologist, Associate Professor Kimberly Norris. She recently made the Path Back from Social Isolation, so you can Google that. Also, I recently published an article on the ABC called Coronavirus Isolation Affects Your Brain, which will go through some of these things that I've talked about today. So I guess the take-home messages here for all of you are that the answers to this situation for many of us are quite accessible and they're simple. You know, exercise, sleep, diet, they're the pillars of good health. And it's also important to take away that, you know, while parts of our abilities and that sort of thing are predetermined by things that we can't control, like our genetics and our upbringing, the choices we make help shape us. So stress is actually good in moderation. And when we're stressed, you know, our heart is pounding, when we're sweating, when we're doing somersaults, if we view those things as signs that our body is packing ourselves full of energy and preparing us to meet a challenge, you know, the evidence says that our health and our performance is actually going to improve. So I might have made you nervous by telling you about all these changes that are happening in the brain in response to stress. But hopefully, I've also made you see that it's normal and it's also reversible if we adopt the right things in our lives. And I guess, you know, at the end of the day, our lives are always going to be filled with the pressures of stress from modern day society, you know, and it's going to cause our brains to change. The life is always going to be filled with these stressful situations, even after COVID-19 passes and is firmly in the rearview vision mirror. And a lot of the time we can't control those situations, but we can control how we respond to them. Have empathy for you and for the people around you. And, you know, if you're thinking about people that you know who are changing, their behavior is changing, maybe share with them today what you've learned about what is happening in the brain to make this happen. You know, if we can embrace stress and understand that it's our body's way of priming us to be our best, I think things will change for us. And that's everything I had for you today. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Lila. That was really wonderful. And I think that that people listening to the presentation will have found plenty that was resonating with the experiences we've had. There are a number of questions, and I'm conscious that we only have 10 minutes. Gosh, they've just suddenly bumped up to 12, so we're going to have to move at a fast pace. But Lila, I wonder, I might try and group some of them together because I've had the advantage of being able to look through them, and some of them can quite easily be grouped together. But the first one that someone sent in right when you got started was asking a simple whether such a simple and assumed chemical action such as making neural pathways, why is that so exhausting? Why does making neural pathways exhaust us?
I love that question. And the reason for that is if you think about it, when you're making a new highway, you need lots of fuel and rocks and you need to dig out a trench. When you're learning new things, you're making physical new connections. You're physically adding bits of brain, and that needs all the chemicals and the physical cellular structure. Making new cells takes energy. So those new connections that we're making between cells physically takes energy to produce them.
One that seems a sort of topic that seems to have got a lot of people who are listening interested is you talked about the things that we can do, that's kind of the fresh air, the exercise and so forth. Wondering about the effects of virtual responses to that. So virtual meetings, talking to people by Zoom like we're doing now versus actually physically meeting. Presumably that still has some benefits that are better than not doing any of those things at all. So the real human contact is advantageous, but people are asking how in a virtual world do these things work?
Terrific question. I guess you can think of the degrees of contact as stratifying how good it is. So if we're physically in contact with someone, we're going to get more of this oxytocin being released, which is reducing our stress response. Then if we're talking to someone on, I guess, virtually face-to-face, we're still getting a lot of that stimuli. If you're talking to someone and hearing their voice, we know that that's releasing oxytocin, but a little bit less. And then when we're just texting, we're just seeing words, we're not getting any of that oxytocin at all. So we're getting a very clear, I guess, stratification of our physical response depending on how physical that contact is.
Thank you. Another topic which got a couple of people interested was the difference between sort of extroverts and introverts and how this kind of lockdown world affects those. So Lee Arnold in particular is saying that lots of rich and varied experiences reduce stress and the likelihood of dementia. What happens if you're an introvert and prefer not to have lots of those experiences? And the same with extroverts do. Is that problematic, or is that actually quite good for introverts? They're actually better able to cope with these things.
I guess it can be very advantageous for introverts, because if you are not seeking that stimulation and it's not so much part of your biological wiring, I could surmise that you're not going to be quite as affected by it. But ultimately, we do need those connections to be allowing us to function at our most optimal. So an introvert might seek engagement with people in a different way, and it might just be texting, for example. It's still social engagement, but it's just kind of in a way that doesn't cause as much anxiety. So I guess it's a way of us, you know, choosing a method of engaging with people that works best with what stresses us out the least.
Kirsten Fraser was sort of taking that in a slightly different direction, but was saying, what comes first, social isolation or stress? So does a stressed person have trouble socializing, or does the social isolation cause the stress?
So the social isolation definitely causes the stress, but also we know that socializing decreases our I guess the physiological responses to stress. So by socializing with someone, you know, it's reducing these stress hormones in our body. I'm not sure if I've quite answered that question correctly.
Well, it probably also comes back to your previous answer, which is it depends what your natural predisposition is, because the question was around whether you does stress cause social isolation or social isolation cause stress. Well, if you actually quite like to be quite isolated, then that's not going to cause a stressful situation. So it really depends how you're wired in the first place, I guess.
That's right. That's right.
And somebody, Angela Ryan says, what about people who relish solitude? We've talked about that, but do they die younger too?
Oh, sorry, I just had an alert on my computer which blocked out the sound. Could you ask that question again?
Yes, for those who relish solitude, is it the case that, given some of the science that you shared, is it the case that they are likely to die younger too? So solitude in itself might have a shorter lifespan.
Yeah, this is a tricky question, because I guess it comes back to that question around whether you're an introvert and whether you actually are stressed out by being in those situations. All I can say is a science that looks at people who have been isolated for many, many years, the science says that you have a greater risk of not coping with stress and increased mortality later in life as well.
And presumably some of the things you were saying before about those who volunteer, who choose and have some expectation about solitude versus those who find themselves unexpectedly in solitude is going to have some bearing here too, isn't it? Now I've skipped over a question, but I must go back to Caroline Van Riet. Asked, does the amygdala size decrease once long-term stress is resolved?
Yes, so the evidence suggests that yes, it does. And I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but they've shown that, for example, monks who are meditating is a way of actually increasing that amygdala size as well. So by actually engaging with meditation and mindfulness in your lives, it can actually help speed up that process.
All right. Mark Limas, what are your thoughts on using mindfulness and meditation to help relieve stress versus exercise?
Right. So I guess people haven't really compared the two directly, so I can't say whether one is better than the other. But certainly mindfulness and meditation has been shown to decrease the amygdala size and therefore decrease our reactivity to situations. It decreases our stress hormones. Exercise, on the other hand, seems to have a bigger range of effects. So it decreases our stress hormones. It's releasing endorphins. It's activating our reward pathway. So I guess if you had to choose between one and the other, I would have an inclination to choose exercise over mindfulness and meditation. But balance and having a bit of both, I think, would be the optimum if possible.
Okay. Anna Anna, I don't know whether it actually is Anna, or Anna has just written her name twice. Your discussion around the isolation during this period has made me think about the elderly in nursing homes, pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. And she's thinking about those sensory and social deprivation and brain-starved versus, sort of stimulation, increasing anxiety, creating aggression, hallucination. So there's been much attention in the public press, rightly so, around the care of the elderly during this process. So has there been a great deal learned through this process, or is it too early to say about how we might treat people in care homes differently from what we've learned through COVID-19?
Oh, I think we have so much information that we can take from what we know about being in isolation, and we should be applying it to the, the aged care system. And the fact that it's not, I think, is a travesty and a point of ignorance by many of us. And there are a lot of new aged care centres which are really looking into addressing this, because it is a significant issue, but it just hasn't really been. We tend not to value our older people as they should be. So I think we need to be addressing that more going forward, for sure.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here that are around sleep. So I might just put them together and say, somebody's asking, Jill Taylor's asking, if you're not sleeping, do you have a view as to whether it's better to take a sleeping tablet or to go without sleep? That's quite extreme in either case, I guess. But what should someone do if they're really struggling with sleep?
Yeah, I would go with taking the sleeping tablet. We do know that the sleep that you have when you've had a sleeping tablet is not high quality sleep, but ultimately you are getting some of that, the rejuvenating effects of sleep. Now, one thing that I didn't mention about sleep is that it's basically the time where all the waste is removed from your brain. So as you go through the course of your day, every other cell in the body is making waste and it's being wicked away, and then you pee it out essentially. But in your brain, it stays there and it builds up throughout the course of the day. And the only time that it's removed is when you're sleeping. So if you don't sleep, that waste builds up and it stops your brain working effectively. So I would rather, in any case, take artificial sleep than have no sleep.
Yeah. And somebody else has asked, they've got a friend who has I would say significantly less sleep, and particularly less than the recommended sleep. So they're wondering about, does that matter really? So somebody who takes has got trained in a way to do with less sleep, so 5 hours a night, versus the recommendation instead of 9. So presumably, again, this is part of training. If you have learned to live with less and you can still function, then presumably that's okay. I guess you're going to say more is always better, but if they've learned, they've created a habit around surviving on less.
Yeah, I think you're right there, but also just imagine how much better you could be functioning if you had the actual amount that your body needed. Sure, it might have become your new normal to function at that level, but you're really starving your brain of the environment that it needs to function optimally.
Thank you, Lila. I'm conscious it's 2 o'clock, and so I'll just finish. I haven't been able to answer everyone, so it's great that so many questions are coming through. But just while we're on the matter of sleep, someone said, thank you. It's amazing. I had trouble sleeping and never thought stress was a good thing until now. But it's the type of stress that's important. And she asks, is there a book that you've written?
Oh, a book? A book that I've written?
Yeah.
No, I haven't written a book yet, but I certainly will look to do that in the future.
So there's something for you. Well, look, I'm going to wrap up because it is 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Certainly here in Tasmania, we know we've got people joining from all over the world, but our hour is up. Lila, thank you so much for your presentation, for the time you put into preparing, and for doing a breakneck speed of trying to get through as many questions as we could. As we say, this webinar is available to look at another time. And so if you've got friends who haven't been able to catch up, or if you'd like to go back over the presentation, please do look at that. We've got up on the screen our next lecture, which is with Minnie Dark, who's an alumna and senior lecturer here. And she's going to be talking about the secrets of writing an award-winning novel. Since she herself is an award-winning novelist, it's a very good person to listen to. So that's on Friday, the 10th of July, 1 p.m. here in Tasmania. So once again, thank you, Lila. Thank you to all of you for joining us and for giving up an hour of your time for this, our first Explore webinar as part of our alumni series. Have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to you joining us again for our next webinar on the 10th of July. Thank you all.